In the unrelenting summer of 1878, a single act of kindness could be a death sentence. For Sarah Whitestone, a widow clinging to her isolated homestead in the Arizona Territory's Sonoran Desert, that sentence was about to be read. She wasn't looking for trouble when the sandstorm hit, a monstrous whirlwind of dust and grit that swallowed the world whole. But trouble found her in the form of two small, dust-covered figures she nearly mistook for tumbleweeds caught against a rock. Two Apache boys, lost and at the edge of death. Saving them would pit her against her neighbors, the law, and a violent past she couldn't outrun. But leaving them to die would mean losing the last piece of her own soul. This isn't just a story of survival. It's the true account of how a lone woman's choice brought a warrior to her door, not for war, but for a debt that could only be paid in trust. The wind was a living thing, a predator, a great invisible beast that prowled the edges of the Sonoran Desert. Its voice was a dry, rasping howl that promised oblivion. It clawed at the adobe walls of Sarah Whitestone's cabin, searching for any weakness, any crack in the armor of her solitude. For 2 days it had not ceased. For 2 days, the world beyond her two small windows had been nothing but a churning vortex of red dust and sand. Sarah, or Sadie, as her late husband Jonah had called her, was 32, though the harsh desert sun and harsher grief had etched lines around her eyes that suggested more. She moved with an economy born of necessity. Every log thrown into the clay fireplace, every scoop of cornmeal from the sack, every trip to the small attached lean-to to check on her mule and 2 chickens, was a calculated expenditure of energy. Jonah had been gone for 2 years, taken by a fever that had swept through their small settlement near Tucson. He'd left her with this 160-acre homestead, a sturdy adobe cabin he'd built with his own hands, and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight in her chest. Most folks thought she was crazy for staying. A woman alone in Apache country, with the wounds of recent raids still festering. Go back east, Sarah, they'd said. Sell the claim. But this land, this cabin, was all she had left of him. Leaving it would be like burying him a second time. So she stayed, her companions a Winchester rifle propped near the door, a scruffy mutt named Dusty, and the ghosts of a happier time. On the 3rd day of the sandstorm, the wind's howl rose to a piercing scream. Sand wasn't just blowing, it was being driven horizontally, piling in great sculpted drifts that buried fences and reshaped the landscape into something alien and hostile. Sadie had just finished portioning out a meager meal of beans and cornbread when Dusty, who had been dozing by the hearth, lifted his head. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Sadie whispered, her hand instinctively going to the worn stock of the Winchester. Dusty padded to the door, whining, his tail giving a short, uncertain wag before tucking between his legs. He scratched at the thick wood. It wasn't the aggressive bark he used for coyotes or the excited yelp for the rare visitor. This was a sound of confusion, of distress. Sadie pressed her ear to the door but heard only the maelstrom. "There's nothing out there but death, Dusty," she said, but he wouldn't settle. He whined again, more insistent, looking from the door to her with pleading eyes. Against her better judgment, she conceded. The heat and grit that blasted into the cabin when she unlatched the heavy bar was a physical blow. It stole her breath and stung her eyes. She pulled her thick cotton shawl tighter around her head, peering into the blinding chaos. "See? Nothing," she began, but stopped. Through the shrieking wind, she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost a hallucination. A high, thin cry like a lamb almost stolen by the gale. Dusty heard it too and let out a single sharp bark that Sadie's heart hammered against her ribs. No person in their right mind would be out in this. It had to be an animal, a coyote perhaps, or a trap. She should slam the door, bolt it, and pile furniture against it. That was the smart thing, the safe thing. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and it sounded less like a lamb and more like a child. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, the words catching in the dry air. She made a decision that defied all logic. Grabbing the coil of rope she kept by the door, she tied one end to the iron door latch and the other around her waist. It was her only hope of finding her way back. With the Winchester in one hand and a lantern she knew would be useless in the other, she stepped out into the choking sandstorm. The force of the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The sand was ankle-deep in places, drifts piling against rocks and cacti. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Dusty plunged ahead, his barks now her only guide. She followed the sound, the rope playing out behind her, a fragile thread connecting her to life. She stumbled, falling hard into a drift of sand, the grit stinging her face and clogging her lungs. For a terrifying moment, she panicked, flailing in the suffocating dust. Then her hand found the taut rope. She pulled herself up, gasping, her lungs burning. This was madness. Utter madness. Sarah Whitestone found them not 20 yards from her own fence line, which was now half buried under shifting dunes of sand. Dusty was digging frantically at a small mound, whining piteously. At first, all Sadie saw was a heap of what looked like tattered hide, dusted with red grit. Then she saw a hand, a small, brown hand, fingers curled and cracked from the dry cold of the desert night. Her blood ran cold. She dropped the rifle and clawed at the sand. First one body, then another. They were boys, 2 of them, dressed in buckskin leggings and tunics, their black hair matted with dust. They were Apache. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Everything she had been taught, everything she had been warned about, screamed in her head, the stories of raids, of Apache warriors striking from the shadows, of the constant fear that permeated every settlement in the Arizona territory. These were the enemy. The younger boy, who couldn't have been more than 5 or 6, was unconscious, his face a pale, ashen gray. The older one, maybe 8 or 9, had his arms wrapped around his little brother in a final protective embrace. His eyes were open, but glazed, unfocused. A faint, rattling breath escaped his lips. Sadie looked at their faces, stripped of all politics and prejudice by the brutal hand of the storm. They weren't warriors. They weren't a threat. They were children, and they were dying on her doorstep. In that moment there was no choice. Not for a woman who had prayed for a child of her own and been denied, not for a woman who understood loss down to the marrow of her bones. With a surge of adrenaline, she worked. She looped the rope around the older boy, who was heavier, and began to drag him, her boots sinking deep into the sand with every agonizing step. Dusty nudged and pushed at the smaller boy, seeming to understand. The 20 yards back to the cabin felt like 20 miles. She hauled the first boy onto the porch, his body a dead weight, then untied the rope and plunged back into the storm for the second. When she finally slammed the door shut and bolted it, she collapsed against it, her body trembling with exertion and heat, sucking in the warm, sage-scented air of the cabin as if it were life itself. On the floor before the hearth lay the 2 dust-covered boys, artifacts of the storm delivered to her door. The real trouble, she knew, hadn't been the sandstorm. It was just beginning. She stripped them of their gritty hide clothing, her fingers clumsy and coated with sand. Their skin was shockingly cold, mottled and pale. She could barely find a pulse on the younger one. She wrapped them in her warmest wool blankets, even taking the quilt from her own bed, the one her mother had made. She propped them near the fire, close enough to feel its heat but not so close as to burn. She spent the next hours in a desperate, frantic battle against the cold that had seeped into their bones. She warmed broth, forcing it drop by drop between their blue-tinted lips. She rubbed their hands and feet, trying to bring life back to the frozen flesh, praying under her breath. Please, God, please, not these 2. Not now. As the hours bled into one another, a change occurred. The waxy gray of the younger boy's skin slowly, miraculously gave way to a faint reddish flush. His breathing, once shallow and ragged, deepened. The older boy stirred first, his eyes fluttering open. This time, they were focused, and they were filled with a terror so profound it silenced the howling wind outside. He tried to scramble away, to put himself between Sadie and his brother, but he was too weak. Sadie held up her hands, keeping her voice low and soft. Easy now. You're safe. You're warm. He didn't understand her words, but he understood her tone. He watched her every move, his dark eyes suspicious, wary, a wild thing cornered. He was a sentinel, a tiny, exhausted warrior, still standing guard over his charge. Sadie looked from the boy's frightened face to the Winchester leaning against the wall. She had brought the enemy into her home. But as she looked at them, 2 small boys wrapped in her dead mother's quilt, she knew she had done the only thing she could, and she would face whatever came next. Outside, the sandstorm raged on, but inside the small cabin, a far more complicated storm was just beginning to gather. The sandstorm broke on the 5th day. It did not end so much as it collapsed from exhaustion, leaving behind a world remade in red dust and sculpted dunes. The silence that followed was immense, broken only by the faint clatter of settling grit against the adobe walls of Sarah Whitestone's cabin. For Sadie, the silence was more menacing than the storm's roar. The sandstorm had provided cover and excuse. Now, under a sky of blinding blue, her secret was exposed. The boys, whom she had come to think of by their Apache names, she'd later learn Tanos, the older, hawk-eyed one, and Kui, the younger, stockier one, were recovering. The color had returned to their faces, and the broth had been replaced with a thin stew, which they ate with a silent, desperate hunger. Kui, the little one, had thawed physically and emotionally. He now watched Sadie with wide-eyed curiosity, his fear replaced by a child's simple acceptance of warmth and food. He'd even smiled, a brief, shy flash of white teeth, when Dusty had licked his hand. Tanos was another matter entirely. He remained a fortress of suspicion. He sat upright, a blanket draped over his shoulders like a chief's robe, his eyes tracking Sadie's every move. He was the protector, and he had not relinquished his duty. He spoke only to his brother in the soft, flowing cadence of their native tongue, his voice a low murmur of reassurance. Communication was a slow, painstaking pantomime. Sadie would point to the water bucket. "Water," she'd say, enunciating clearly. Tanos would just stare. Kui, however, would point and repeat, "Water." The sound clumsy on his tongue. A small bridge was built. Food, fire, blanket. Each word was a single plank laid across a vast canyon of culture and language. The first true crack in Tanos's armor came not from a word, but from a piece of wood. Sadie, sitting by the fire in the evenings, would often take out her pocket knife, Jonah's old knife, and a block of mesquite. It was a habit, a way to keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dark paths. She was carving a small bird, its wings outstretched. Kui watched, fascinated, crawling closer, resting his chin on his hands. When she was done, she smoothed the rough edges and held it out to him. He took it reverently, his small fingers tracing the shape of the wings. He chirped, a perfect imitation of a desert quail. Sadie smiled, a real, unburdened smile for the first time in days. She looked at Tanos. The older boy was watching, and for the briefest of moments, the suspicion in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of respect. He gave her a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It was more eloquent than any word of thanks, but the fragile peace inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the danger lurking outside. On the 6th day, she saw the smoke, a thin plume rising from the chimney of the Harlan homestead, a mile down the valley. That meant Clara Harlan would soon be on the move. Clara Harlan was the town's self-appointed moral compass and chief purveyor of gossip. A gaunt, severe woman with eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that soured milk, she considered Sadie's continued presence on the homestead an affront to decency and common sense. As if summoned by the thought, a knock came at the door late the next afternoon. It was sharp and impatient. Before Sadie could even think of a lie, Tanos had grabbed Kui, pulling him into the small sleeping loft and drawing the thick curtain she'd hung there. Sadie opened the door to find Mrs. Harlan standing there, wrapped in a thick shawl against the lingering dust, her face pinched against the heat. "Sarah," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "I came to see if you were still among the living. A storm like that, it's no place for a woman alone." She peered past Sadie into the cabin, her eyes scanning everything. "I managed, Clara," Sadie said, blocking the doorway as best she could. "The cabin is strong, so it seems." Mrs. Harlan sniffed. "Smells like you've been cooking for an army. Must be lonely, all that food for one." Her eyes darted to the 2 extra blankets folded by the fire, to the small, empty bowl on the table that Sadie hadn't had time to clear away. Her gaze lingered on the pair of small, worn moccasins tucked beside the wood box. That Sadie's heart froze. She'd forgotten the moccasins. I like to be prepared," she stammered. "You never know." "Indeed," Mrs. Harlan said, a thin, knowing smile playing on her lips. "One never does. I saw tracks near your fence line. Small ones. Too small for a man. Almost looked like, well, no matter. Just be careful, Sarah. The road to Tucson is finally clear. But there's talk. A war party from San Carlos reported 2 boys missing from their summer camp. Children of a chief, no less. They believe they wandered off before the sandstorm. Their brother, a warrior they call Tsalei, has sworn to find them. He's said to be formidable. You wouldn't want to be caught in the middle of something like that." The veiled threat hung in the air. Mrs. Harlan knew, or at least she suspected enough to make trouble. "Thank you for the warning, Clara," Sadie said, her voice tight. "Just looking out for you, dear," she said, turning to leave. "After all, we must look after our own." The moment the door closed, Sadie sagged against it. Her safe little world had been breached. The story would be all over Tucson by nightfall. People would come. The sheriff, maybe, or worse, vigilantes who wouldn't bother to ask questions. The moment Clara Harlan left, Sarah Whitestone felt the weight of her predicament settle like a stone in her chest. Up in the loft, Tanos had heard it all. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone of the visitor's voice, the fear in Sadie's. When he came down, his face was grim. He walked to the table, took a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and began to draw on a smoothed piece of mesquite bark. He drew 2 small stick figures and a larger one. Then he drew a man. This man was different, drawn with angry, jagged lines. He gave him a hat and a long coat and put a rifle in his hand. Tanos made a sound, a low, guttural hiss. He pointed at the angry stick figure. "Slade," he said. The name was like a stone hitting water. He then drew a picture of a wickiup and another figure lying on the ground. He drew the man named Slade standing over the figure. Then he drew the 2 small stick figures running away into a swirling vortex of lines that represented the sandstorm. The story was suddenly horrifyingly clear. They hadn't just been lost. They had been running, fleeing this man, Slade. The sandstorm hadn't been the thing that almost killed them, it had been the thing that saved them from him. Sadie's problem had just grown infinitely larger. She wasn't just hiding 2 lost Apache boys. She was harboring fugitives from a killer, a white man, a man who, if he found them here, would not hesitate to kill all 3 of them to cover his tracks. Meanwhile, miles away, a lone rider pushed his horse through the sun-baked sand. He was a tall man, his face weathered and grim, his eyes dark and sharp as a hawk's, scanning the horizon. This was T.S. Alii. He had been riding for 3 days, stopping only for the briefest of rests, his heart a cold knot of fear for his younger brothers. He had followed their trail until the sandstorm had erased it completely. Now he was moving on instinct and prayer, riding toward the faint plumes of smoke from the white settlements, a place he despised, a place he knew his brothers would have avoided unless they had no other choice. He rode not as a warrior seeking war, but as a brother seeking his blood, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. His path was converging on a small, isolated cabin where a lone woman was discovering that an act of mercy had just become an act of war. The 3 days that followed Clara Harlan's visit were a study in suffocating silence. The world outside was pristine, a landscape of dazzling red sand under a vast, indifferent blue sky. But inside the cabin, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was magnified. The soft scuff of Qui's mended moccasins on the floorboards, the crackle of mesquite in the hearth, the whisper of wind stirring the sand outside. Each noise was a potential harbinger of doom. Sadie found her routines altered by a new, sharp-edged vigilance. When she fetched water from the well, her eyes weren't on the bucket but on the dark, silent line of cacti and mesquite that marked the edge of the clearing. She chopped wood with her back against the cabin wall, the Winchester always within a few feet. She was no longer just a woman surviving, she was a sentinel on duty, and her small homestead had become a watchtower. A silent, profound understanding had grown between her and Tanos. The boy's watchfulness now mirrored her own. He would sit for hours near the window, not looking out with a child's curiosity, but with the grim focus of a scout. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the room, and in that shared glance, a volume of unspoken words would pass. "Are we safe?" "Not yet. But we are ready." Her fear for them had transformed into something fiercely protective. They were no longer just 2 lost Apache boys. They were Tanos and Qui. They were under her roof. They were her responsibility. The arrival came, as such things often do, not with a bang, but with a sudden, unnatural quiet. It was just past dawn, the air sharp and crystalline. The desert birds, which had been tentatively chirping in the new day, fell silent all at once. Even the wind seemed to pause. Dusty, who had been dozing, lifted his head from his paws, not with a growl, but with a low, uneasy whine. He rose, the fur on his neck ridging slightly, and stared at the door as if he could see through the solid adobe. Sadie's blood went cold. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, the moment Clara Harlan had promised would come. "Loft," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent rasp. "Now." Tanos, his face instantly pale but his movements sure, grabbed his little brother's hand. He didn't question or hesitate. He scrambled up the ladder into the small sleeping loft, his last act before disappearing to pull the thick curtains shut, plunging their hiding place into shadow. Sadie's hands, slick with sudden sweat, closed around the familiar, solid weight of the Winchester. She moved to the side of the window, her body pressed flat against the adobe, and peered through the narrowest of gaps in the curtain. He was there. At the far edge of the clearing, partially shielded by a towering saguaro, sat a rider on a paint horse. He wasn't a prospector or a trapper. He sat his horse with a stillness that was part of the landscape itself, a man who belonged to the rock and sand in a way no white man ever could. The rider was wrapped in a thick woven blanket against the morning chill, his long braided hair catching the first rays of sun. A single hawk feather, stark and perfect, was tied in his hair, a mark of authority and power. Even from 100 yards, his presence was overwhelming. He was a force, coiled and waiting. This had to be T.S. Alii. He nudged his horse forward, breaking from the cover of the cacti into the open. He didn't ride fast, but with a slow, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than a charge. His eyes, sharp and dark, weren't just looking at the cabin, they were dissecting it. He scanned the chimney for the thickness of its smoke, the roof for its condition, the ground for the faint, disturbed patterns in the sand Sarah Whitestone had tried so hard to erase. This was not a man who missed a single detail. He was a hunter, and he was tracking his quarry. Sadie's mind screamed. What did she do? This wasn't a faceless marauder from a Tucson gossip tale. This was a brother searching for his kin. But he was also an Apache warrior in a land where that title alone was enough to get a man shot. If she revealed the boys, would he see her as a savior or a captor? If she hid them, would he tear the cabin apart to find them? He dismounted with fluid grace, his feet making no sound on the packed sand. A bough was slung across his back, and a long knife was sheathed at his hip. He began to walk toward her home, his gaze locked on the front door. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sadie cocked the Winchester. The metallic click-clack was an obscene violation of the morning quiet, a sound of irreversible commitment. T.S. Alii stopped 20 feet from the porch. He did not shout or threaten. He simply stood there, a figure of immense, patient menace, his stillness a challenge. He knew. He knew they were inside. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the silence a taut wire between them. Sadie knew this standoff could not last. She had to act. She had to control the narrative. Taking a final, steadying breath, she unbolted the heavy door and opened it just enough to push the long, dark barrel of the rifle through the gap. "State your purpose," she called out. Her voice came out stronger than she felt, the words stark and formal in the clean, dry air. The warrior's piercing eyes met hers. They held no surprise, only a vast, soul-deep weariness, an agony of not knowing banked by a burning anger. He spoke, and his voice was the sound of stones grinding together in a dry riverbed, the low, guttural cadence of the Apache language. The words were sharp, demanding, a fusillade of questions she couldn't understand but whose meaning was brutally clear. Where are they? What have you done with them? Tell me before I tear this place apart. I don't understand you, Sadie said, her grip tightening on the rifle stock. If you're looking for two boys, they are here. They are safe. Her words did not soothe him. His face hardened into a mask of granite disbelief. A white woman with a rifle claiming his brothers were safe. It was the oldest lie, the cruelest trick. He took a single, deliberate step forward. Stay back. Sadie's voice cracked with strain as she raised the rifle to her shoulder, the iron sight lining up with his chest. I don't want to hurt you, but I will. So help me God, I will. It was an impossible tableau. The lone, desperate woman defending her home and the grieving, desperate warrior trying to reclaim his family, both trapped by a history of violence and mistrust they hadn't created but were forced to inherit. The standoff was shattered not by a bullet, but by a child's cry. T.S. Alii. The voice, small and clear, came from the cabin's doorway. The curtain to the loft had been pushed aside. Little Qui, his face streaked with tears of fear and hope, was peering down. The moment his eyes locked on the man in the sand, his entire being transformed. Pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face. He scrambled down the ladder with a speed that defied his small size, his only thought to get to his brother. He ran right past Sadie, a small brown blur, and launched himself from the porch into the warrior's arms. The iron mask of Tsa's composure finally cracked. He dropped to one knee in the sand, the great woven blanket falling open as he enveloped his little brother. His arms, which looked strong enough to fell a tree, were impossibly gentle. He murmured to Kui in their language, his deep voice now thick with emotion, rocking him softly as his large hands roamed over the boy's head and back, checking for injury, for any sign of harm. Tanos appeared at the doorway behind Sadie. He did not run. He stood straight and tall, a small, solemn figure shouldering a great burden. He looked at his older brother, who was still kneeling, clutching Kui as if he were the last precious thing on earth. And then Tanos began to speak. He pointed a finger at the vast, sand-covered landscape, his voice filled with the memory of its biting grit. He pointed at his own thin chest, his gestures telling of hunger and exhaustion. Then he turned and pointed his finger directly at Sarah Whitestone. He spoke for a long time, his voice rising and falling in an earnest, unbroken stream of Apache. He pointed to the hearth, to the empty stew pot, to the warm blanket. He was telling the story, the whole story, the sandstorm, the rescue, the warmth, the kindness. As Tanos spoke, Tsa's gaze slowly lifted from Kui and settled on Sadie. The raw fury in his eyes began to recede, washed away by the tide of his brother's testimony. It was replaced by a profound confusion, then a dawning, reluctant understanding. He was truly seeing her for the first time, not as a faceless settler, an enemy, but as the woman his brother was describing. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the stark fear she was still trying to master. He saw the worn calico dress and the calloused hands of a woman who worked hard, and he saw the Winchester she still held, noting for the first time that its barrel was now pointed safely at the ground. Slowly, Tsa rose to his full, imposing height, with Kui clinging tightly to his leg as if he might vanish. He looked from Sadie to the sturdy cabin to the thin, life-giving smoke that curled from its chimney, the beacon that had saved his blood. He spoke again, just one word in his own tongue, his voice no longer a challenge but a raw, open question. Sadie understood. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "They are safe," she repeated, her voice now soft. "But there is more. We are not safe. There is danger." She stepped back from the doorway, pulling the door wide open. It was the greatest risk she had yet taken, an invitation across a chasm of fear and blood. It was an offering of truce. For a long, agonizing moment, Tsa hesitated. To enter a settler's home was to cross into the heart of the world that was devouring his own. It went against every instinct, but his brother stood on that threshold, alive and warm. He looked at Tanos, who met his gaze and gave a single, solemn nod of confirmation. Trust her. With a final glance at the desert that had almost claimed his family, Tsa, the formidable Apache warrior, stepped over the threshold and into Sarah Whitestone's home. The air inside was warm and smelled of mesquite and stew. His eyes took in everything at once. The blankets by the fire, the small carved bird on the mantel, and on the table, the piece of smoothed mesquite bark covered in Tanos's charcoal drawings. He saw the stick figures of the boys, the swirls of the sandstorm, and the third figure drawn with angry, jagged lines, the monstrous man with the hat and the rifle. Tsa's breath caught in his throat. He strode to the table and stared down at the drawing, his face hardening into a mask of recognition and pure hate. He pointed a finger at the crude image, his voice a venomous hiss. Slade. The name hung in the air, a shared curse. The fragile gratitude of the moment was instantly incinerated by the heat of this shared enemy. Tsa looked from the drawing to Sadie, and his quest changed in a heartbeat. He had ridden for days to find his family, to offer thanks or exact vengeance. Now he saw that he was here to do both. His journey had not ended at her door, it had led him to the eve of another battle. The air inside the cabin grew thick, heavy with a substance far denser than wood smoke. The fragile peace of the last few days had evaporated, replaced by the grim, metallic tension of impending violence. Tsa's presence, which had at first been an intrusion, now felt like the cabin's central pillar. He moved with a predator's economy, his silence more potent than any shout, his eyes constantly scanning, assessing, memorizing the geometry of their small world. The canyon of culture between them remained, but now they had a singular, desperate reason to bridge it. On the rough-hewn floorboards, using a charred stick from the hearth, they held their council of war. Tsa, with Tanos acting as a hesitant, wide-eyed interpreter, scratched out the story that had been a dark shadow and gave it terrifying form. He confirmed the name Tanos had whispered, Declan Slade. He drew a crude symbol for a government treaty, then slashed a line through it, a promise broken. He drew Slade's face, a contortion of angry lines, and next to it, the figure of a proud man with a feathered headdress. He laid his hand over the second figure and said the Apache word for father. His voice a low rumble of granite and grief. He described the ambush not with words but with swift, brutal gestures, a hand indicating a lie, a sudden strike, a fall. As he did, Tanos's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his older brother's side. Tsalia's arm wrapped around him, a shield of muscle and buckskin. He looked at Sadie, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He didn't need to explain the rest. She understood. She was harboring the last two witnesses to a murder, and the killer was coming to silence them forever. Slade will come, Tsa stated, the three English words landing like coffin nails. He pointed a long, steady finger out the window toward the vast, sand-swept expanse of desert. He follows tracks. He is a snake in the sand. A cold knot formed in Sadie's stomach, but it was threaded with something new, defiance. This was her land, her home. Jonah had poured his life into these walls. She would not let a man like Slade defile it. He won't be expecting to find you here, she said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know it possessed. She knelt, taking the charcoal from his hand. He'll be expecting a lone woman and two scared children. She altered his drawing of the terrain, adding a deep, rocky arroyo to the west of the cabin. He will come from there, she said, pointing, under cover of the mesquite. Tsa studied her addition, then looked at her with a flicker of new respect. She was not just a soft-hearted woman. She understood the land, the way of the hunter, the mind of an ambusher. He nodded his assent. An unspoken command structure clicked into place. He was the general of this war, but she was the master of this fortress. The hours that followed were a blur of grim, purposeful activity. There was no time for fear to take root, there was only work. Together, they dragged the heavy oak table Jonah had built, wedging it against the front window to create a solid barricade. The scrape of its legs across the floor was a sound of finality. They were sealing themselves in. Tsa moved through the cabin, his warrior's mind transforming everyday objects into instruments of defense. He pointed to her water bucket. Water, he said, using the word Kui had taught him, making a gesture of dousing a fire. Sadie understood immediately and began filling every pot and pail she owned. While she worked, he took Jonah's old hunting knife and, with the precision of a surgeon, carved 3 small, nearly invisible firing slits into the adobe walls, one facing west, one south, and one beside the door. They were low to the ground, offering protection and a clear line of sight. Sadie watched him, mesmerized by his efficiency. He was a force of nature, a man born to this kind of struggle. When he finished, he walked over to where her Winchester rested on its pegs. He didn't grab it but simply gestured a silent request. Sadie nodded and he lifted the rifle, his hands treating it with the reverence of a fellow craftsman. He checked the action, sighted down the barrel, and gave a single approving nod before placing it back. In that small gesture, a profound understanding passed between them. He was entrusting her with the defense of one flank. He was treating her not as a liability, but as a fellow soldier. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the desert, a heavy blanket of dread settled with the falling temperature. Sarah Whitestone prepared a thick stew of beans and dried beef, the familiar motions a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. They ate in a tense, profound silence. The boys, sensing the shift in the air, were huddled together in the loft, their usual chatter silenced. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind stirring the sand outside, was a potential threat. Sadie looked across the fire at Tsa. His face was a stoic mask, but she saw the sorrow in his eyes, the immense weight of protecting what was left of his family. For the first time since Jonah's death, she did not feel utterly alone. Her solitude had been breached by a shared, desperate purpose. The attack came with the rising of the moon. Dusty, who had been lying nervously by the hearth, shot to his feet. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of pure menace. Tsalei was on his feet before the first bark escaped the dog's throat. He flowed like smoke to the western wall, a living shadow. "They come," he breathed, the words a wisp of vapor in the chilled air. Sadie's heart seized, then began to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The cellar," she commanded, her voice a harsh whisper to the loft. "Go." She didn't have to look to know Tanos was herding his younger brother toward the trap door. Her focus was singular. She grabbed the Winchester, the cold steel a shocking, solid reality in her trembling hands, and took her position behind the oak table. She peered through the narrow gap between the table and the window frame. 3 riders materialized from the darkness of the mesquite, their forms stark against the luminous sand. The man in the lead was huge, a bear of a man wrapped in a long coat. His face, even at this distance, was a portrait of brutish arrogance. "Declan Slade. Whitestone." His voice was a bull's roar, a sound meant to intimidate, to shatter resolve. "I know you're in there. My trackers followed the little heathens right to your door. A foolish bit of charity, woman. I've got no quarrel with you. Send them out now, and I'll let you live to see the sunrise." His words were poison darts aimed directly at her. He was trying to frame this as her mistake, her folly. Sadie looked at Tsalei. His face was implacable, carved from stone and fury. He gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. Finding her voice, Sadie shouted back, the words tearing from her throat. "They're just children. Leave them be and ride out of here." A harsh, ugly laugh echoed across the clearing. "Those children are the sons of a man who stood in the way of progress. They are a loose end. Now, send them out, or by God, we're coming in." The night exploded. The sharp crack of a rifle shot was followed instantly by the meaty thump of a bullet slamming into the adobe wall just inches from Sadie's head. Dust and grit rained down on her. The siege had begun. What followed was a descent into a nightmare of sound and fury. Gunshots ripped through the night from 2 different positions, chewing at the cabin's walls, cracking the small pane of glass that remained of her window. The cabin, her sanctuary, was being violated, torn apart. Inside, Tsalei was a whirlwind of lethal grace. He moved between the firing slits he had carved, a phantom in the firelight. The sequence was mesmerizing. The smooth draw of the bowstring, a moment of absolute stillness, and the near-silent hiss of an arrow slicing through the air. A moment later, a choked cry would echo from the darkness, followed by the blessed silence of one less gun firing upon them. Sadie, her initial terror burning away into a core of cold, hard rage, found her rhythm. Kneeling behind the table, she became an extension of the Winchester. She didn't fire wildly. She breathed, sighted, and squeezed the trigger, making every one of Jonah's precious cartridges count. She was no longer just a widow. She was a homesteader defending her claim, a mother defending the young, a woman who would not be broken. One of Slade's men, emboldened by the covering fire, made a mad dash for the door. The heavy oak shuddered under the impact of his shoulder, the iron bolt groaning in protest. Before he could strike again, Tsalei's knife flashed in the narrow slit beside the door frame. It was not a throw, it was a swift, precise lunge. The man shrieked, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise, and stumbled back into the darkness, clutching a ruined arm. They were actually holding, but Slade was not a man to give up. "Burn them out," he roared, his voice thick with frustration. A moment later, a fiery comet arced through the sky, a torch made of oil-soaked rags. It landed squarely on the flat adobe roof with a soft thump. Smoke, thick and greasy, began to curl toward the moon. "The roof!" Sadie cried, her heart lurching with a new kind of terror. Fire was an enemy they couldn't fight from within. Tsalei didn't hesitate. He launched himself up the ladder to the loft. "Stay down," he commanded. He shoved open the small square hatch Jonah had built for roof repairs and slithered out into the treacherous, moonlit open. He was a perfect target. Instantly, the remaining rifle cracked, the bullet thudding into the roof scant inches from his leg. He ignored it. With one of the water-soaked blankets, he beat at the spreading flames, a desperate, frantic dance on the edge of death. Sadie watched from below, her breath held, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. He smothered the fire and slid back inside the hatch just as another bullet splintered the wood where his head had been. The firefight dwindled into a tense, waiting silence. "He's trying something else," Tsa Lei whispered, his voice strained, his chest heaving from the exertion. The tense silence that followed the firefight was shattered not by a bang, but by a rending crash. Using the attached animal shed for cover, Declan Slade had used a felled log as a battering ram. The wall connecting the shed to the cabin, a weaker section of adobe construction, splintered and burst inward. Dust, sand, and debris exploded into the room. Through the ragged hole, Slade lunged, his massive frame blotting out the moonlight. His face was a mask of hate, a pistol clutched in his hand. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, found Sarah Whitestone first. He raised his pistol, a grin of triumph spreading across his face. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an agonizing crawl. Sadie fumbled to bring the long barrel of the Winchester around, but she knew she was too slow. This was the end. She never saw Tsa Lei move. He dropped from the loft above, not with a sound, but like a hawk falling from the sky upon its prey. He landed in a silent crouch and launched himself at Slade before the man could process the new threat. Tsa Lei's arm snaked around Slade's thick neck, yanking him backward. The pistol discharged with a deafening roar, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling rafters. The two men crashed to the floor in a brutal, primal struggle. It was a terrifying contest of opposites. Slade had the weight and brute strength, his powerful limbs churning as he tried to break the warrior's hold. But Tsa Lei was a coil of sinew and rage, his movements fluid and precise, using Slade's own momentum against him. It was not a brawl, it was an execution of skill against raw power. Sadie, jolted from her paralysis, saw her chance. Her home was being destroyed, her life was forfeit, and the man responsible was on her floor. A wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over her. She scrambled to the hearth, her hand closing around the familiar heavy handle of her largest cast-iron skillet. It felt impossibly heavy, a tool of sustenance about to become a weapon of war. With a cry that was torn from the very depths of her soul, she raised it high and brought it down in a whistling arc, putting every ounce of her fear, her grief, and her rage into the blow. It connected with the side of Slade's head with a sickening, wet crack that was louder than any gunshot. Slade's eyes rolled back in his head. His body went limp and he collapsed in a heap, unconscious. Silence, a profound, ringing silence, fell over the cabin, broken only by their own ragged, desperate gasps for air. The last of Slade's men, hearing the fight's abrupt end and seeing his leader fall, had mounted up and fled into the forgiving darkness. It was over. Tsa Lei slowly, painfully pushed himself to his feet. He stood over Slade's prone body, his chest rising and falling like a bellows. He looked at the devastation around them, the splintered walls, the shattered glass, the smell of gunpowder and blood that now stained her home. Then his eyes found Sadie. She stood trembling, the skillet still held aloft, her knuckles white. He walked toward her, and for a terrifying second she thought he might be angry. Instead, he gently took the heavy skillet from her grasp and set it quietly on the table. His eyes softened as he saw the gash on her forehead where a flying splinter had cut her. With a tenderness that seemed impossible from a man who had just fought like a demon, he reached out and brushed a stray, blood-matted lock of hair from her face. He looked into her eyes, and in their dark depths she saw a universe of shared combat, of gratitude, and of a respect so profound it needed no words. He didn't need to speak. She understood. The next morning, Sheriff Amos Carter from Tucson rode in with a posse of 2. He'd finally decided to act on Clara Harlan's concerns, only to ride into the aftermath of a small war. They found a bound and groggy Declan Slade, whose claims of self-defense were quickly dismantled when Tanos, with Tsa Lei providing a solemn translation, recounted the true story of his father's murder. It was time. The farewell, when it came, was held in the cold, bright light of a world scrubbed clean. It was an affair of the heart, quiet and deep. Tanos, the little sentinel, stood before her and gave her a formal, solemn bow of a warrior to an equal. Little Kui, who had retrieved his precious carved bird from the floor, simply hugged her leg, his cheek pressed against the rough fabric of her dress. Finally, Tsa Lei stood before her. How to thank someone for the lives of your brothers? For risking their own life? Words were cheap, inadequate things. He reached up and, with great care, untied the single, perfect hawk feather from his hair. It was not an ornament, it was a symbol of immense honor, a medal of the highest courage, a sacred connection between the bearer and the spirit world. He held it out to her on his open palm. For a warrior's heart, he said, his voice a low, resonant timbre. The English was slow, deliberate, each word imbued with meaning. Our families are now one. Nilchai, he said, the Apache word for family, a solemn vow. If you ever have need, look to the hills. We will come. Sadie took the feather. It was impossibly light, yet it felt as if it held the weight of the entire world. Its edges were perfect, its color vibrant. It was the most beautiful, most valuable thing she had ever touched. She stood on the porch of her battered, broken home and watched them ride away, the warrior and the two boys she had pulled from the jaws of the sandstorm. They didn't vanish but seemed to merge back into the landscape, becoming one with the sand and the mesquite. She stood there for a long, long time, the forgotten Winchester leaning against the wall, the hawk feather clutched tight in her hand. The cabin was a wreck, her quiet life shattered. But as she looked out at the silent, majestic hills, she no longer felt like a widow clinging to a ghost. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant strength. She was Sarah Whitestone, the woman with a warrior's heart, and she was home. Sarah Whitestone's story is a powerful reminder that in the vast, often brutal landscape of the American Southwest, the strongest bridges were not built of adobe or stone, but of courage and compassion. The hawk feather she kept on her mantle for the rest of her days was more than a gift. It was a testament to a bond forged in a sandstorm, a quiet treaty of peace signed between two worlds. It teaches us that our shared humanity can be a light in the darkest storm, and that a single brave choice can echo through generations, changing the course of not just one life, but many.